Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Mindshift Podcast. Once again, as always, I am your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I am super excited to be bringing you this episode this week with Tim Sledge, the author of the book Goodbye Jesus. You can also find him on Twitter at goodbye_Jesus, where he is a prolific tweeter as well as an excellent author. And in fact, I'll be providing you with the details of how you can get a hold of some of his writing materials as well as his book in the show notes. One of the things I appreciate about getting to know a person like Tim, he reminds me a lot of my guest I've had on here a couple times, the Naked Pastor David Hayward, and I bring that up in this podcast actually, that all three of us are former evangelical pastors, and not just, we weren't pastors for 5 minutes. In my case, as I mentioned before, for over 20 years, I was an elder, a pastor, then a Bible college teacher. But before that, I had spent many, many years, since 1993, in theological education. I went to Bible college, seminary, went back to seminary, ended up doing a PhD in biblical studies and preaching. And like Tim and David, we spent a huge amount of time in studies, academics, preaching, teaching, ministering, and we were all in. We were elders, we were in charge of churches, we were pastors, we were leaders, we were teachers. People looked up to us. People used to turn to us for spiritual advice. How do I live a successful Christian life according to the Bible, according to Christian theology? And yet, all three of us have walked away, not just from the church, which was obviously a big decision. It was a huge part of our lives for decades, but really from the Christian faith entirely. And I think for a lot of people that are still within the faith, that is a real threat. And people on Twitter are always coming after Tim. They seem to have a special thing for going after Tim. And it's evangelicals who kind of troll him and say, look, you were never a Christian. You were never a Christian in the first place. That's your problem. And I see the tweets that, when they come after him, and they come after people like me a little bit, and people like David. And I think a lot of that, and we talk a little bit about this in this episode in a few minutes coming up, but I think a lot of that is they are so threatened, they are so afraid. If it happened to us, then there's always the possibility that it could happen to them, and they don't want to face that very real fear. So therefore, the easiest, most obvious screed is to say, you were never a Christian to begin with, and so you were a false Christian, and the fact that you've walked away from it all is merely proof or evidence that you were never Christian in the first place. But I beg to differ. Someone like Tim and David, they're going to beg to differ as well. We were totally 100% committed. And I was thinking about this today coming home from work. Becoming a pastor was not an easy job. It was something that was very difficult to do. It was hard to get the gig in the first place. I graduated from Bible college and then seminary, and then I was finally considered, when I had an MA degree and a bachelor's degree, to be worthy, essentially theologically and in terms of my own biblical knowledge, to be able to stand up every Sunday and preach and teach from the Bible, which was a very heavy, a weighty responsibility that I certainly did not take lightly. I took it with the utmost of seriousness. I spent a huge amount of time every week studying the Greek and the Hebrew, reading commentaries to try to get it right. So on Sunday, when I was preaching and teaching, I wouldn't have misinterpreted the Bible. I wouldn't be guilty of leading people astray or telling them something incorrect from the text. It was something I took very, very seriously. However, the problem that we had with it ultimately is it did not deliver on the promises that it made. And that is one of my sort of bedrock problems with the whole thing. And that's the ultimate irony. As I said in the last episode with Daryl Ray, the problem is now we have to recover from religion, and specifically in my case and in the case of many others, evangelical Christianity. And this is one of the ultimate ironies. The very religion that promised so much ended up delivering not only so little, it didn't do what it said on the tin, but even worse than that, there's a ton of religious trauma, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, all the effects of mind control, indoctrination, all the stuff that I've been talking about that relate to the world of the cults also, I believe, in so many ways relates to the world of evangelicalism. And it's not a far cry from a typical evangelical or even a mainstream church that can devolve into very cultic behavior. And something that Tim and I are going to talk about in this episode is specifically the evangelical vote and continued support for President Donald Trump. One of the things that in my case was the last final straw. When I said in 2016, when I saw what was happening, and then I saw this blind, rabid support, which I liken to a cult. I think that's what Donald Trump is basically running, is a political cult of personality, and this blind loyalty on the part of so many evangelicals, and specifically evangelical leaders. This is something that I just said to myself, I'm done. I no longer want to be identified as a Christian. I don't want to call myself a Christian. And that was the final straw for me, this vote, and then continued support for Donald Trump. And that's something I've been talking about a lot with Conway and Siegelman and some other people, Chris Shelton as well. The attempted takeover of not just America, but really of the world on the part of evangelicals and fundamentalists, and something that Tim and I, as I say, are going to talk about in just a minute here. So let's go on into the conversation. I'm going to bring you now my chat with former pastor, but now atheist, Dr. Tim Sledge, and he's going to talk about how he follows the truth no matter where it leads you. And I hope that you find that to be a helpful sort of philosophy or guide as you listen to my conversation with ex-pastor Tim Sledge. I am happy to be joined by author and ex-pastor, ex-evangelical pastor, Tim Sledge, author of Goodbye Jesus. And I think you've just got another book coming out. Isn't that right, Tim?
Well, I have a follow-up book called A Meta-Spiritual Handbook, How to Be Spiritual Without Religion, Faith, or God. And I'm working on another book, which is going to be real short, called, I'm not going to give the title away right now, but it's just some simple questions that a non-believer can ask a believer. It's almost like the equivalent of a gospel tract for people who don't believe in God. It's going to be really simple and just kind of get down to the key arguments.
So it's the reverse of the four spiritual laws sort of thing.
That's right.
Not going to be a chick track or anything.
The three unspiritual questions. Maybe that's what I'll call it.
You can beat them by going 3 instead of 4, see, and then
that's
they won't
right.
read the... Yeah, so I started reading Goodbye Jesus on Amazon. Now I'm thinking I've got to get that book because it's an amazing story, really, of your own, I guess, deconversion. And I think we talked a little bit about, before we hit the record button, that if people really want to get into all the nitty-gritty of your story, is that probably the best place for them to head to get the book?
Yeah, yes. Goodbye Jesus is my spiritual autobiography, and it's the story of my journey not only out of faith, but into faith, because one of the things that I've run into as I dialogue with people online, as you know, a lot of Christians, when we're active on Twitter and we kind of encourage each other and share ideas, but then the Christians come along, they troll and they come after you. And one of the most common things they say is, you never were really a Christian. So I want to say to anybody who says that, read my book, because I start out with how I began my faith as a boy in West Texas, and how my ministry developed, everything, the whole story. It's written kind of more like a novel, but then at the end, I try to drive home what I think are powerful arguments against faith of any kind.
Yeah, it's a very good read, as you were saying. It's it's very engaging. As I was reading, I thought, oh man, there's not enough here at the Amazon preview. It's just enough to pique your interest and make you want, which is obviously the point of the preview. Yeah. They don't want to give too much away. We don't want to give away the ending of the book, even though it's pretty clear by now, by the title of the book, Goodbye Jesus. You've left certainly the church. Could you give us we're going to send readers to your book, but could you give us a short couple of minute rundown of your story? I know we're going to get into the meat of this discussion, which is really getting into the Trump evangelical vote and all that portends for not just America, but the world, really. But can you give us a short synopsis of your story?
Sure. I find that's a nice challenge. So, West Texas, Southern Baptist family, 8 years old, I decided to read the whole Bible in 1 year. Midway through, I walked the aisle in my little Southern Baptist church and give my life to Jesus, confess my sins, and receive the promise of eternal life. The background, my father is a good man, a loving dad, but he's a binge alcoholic. That makes life complicated. But I go to church whenever my family takes me. And then fast forward a little bit, I'm 16 years old. I'm still in West Texas, Odessa, Texas, the home of the Friday Night Lights football team, the Permian Panthers. I'm in high school there. A dynamic minister comes to our church, and we become friends. And soon I'm walking the aisle because I believe that God has called me to be a preacher. I start preaching at age 16. Soon I'm speaking in some church or to some group in West Texas almost every week. I'm elected president of my student body. You know, life just really unfolds in a good way for me. I go off to school at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, Billy Graham's alma mater, get a degree in Bible, come back to Texas to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, where I get a master's degree and a doctorate degree. And then I serve as a pastor, first in a suburb of New York City for 6 years, then outside of Phoenix, Arizona, and then back to Houston, where it sort of all comes together, and I'm able to lead a church to grow from 5,000 to 2,000 plus members in about 10 years. And there I start a recovery ministry, a support group ministry for hurting people. It just takes off, explodes, leads to my writing several books about that are used by support groups. And it's really powerful. I'm going to stop right there and just say, at that point, some things started to happen in my life. And really the first thing that happened was getting involved in this support group ministry and seeing how much that helped people compared to, say, just praying about your problems. And then a series of events happened over the next about 10 or 12 years that dramatically changed my life and brought me to a place of saying goodbye, Jesus. And it was painful. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something I thought about an awful lot. And so here I am today.
And for the rest of the story, read the book then.
Right. I think that was 3 minutes. I'm gonna give myself a pat on the back.
Yeah. Well, we could just sit here and twiddle our thumbs for the next 2 minutes then and just let the silence fill the airwaves. Yeah. Well, I wanted to mention, I think you must have meant to say, you said you took it from 5,000 to 2,000, but I think you said, must have been from 500.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
It wasn't reverse growth.
Yeah. That would be a real accomplishment to take it down to half size.
Yeah.
No, it was 500 to 2,000 members.
2,000. Yeah. Although I was a youth pastor of a church out of Portland, Oregon, and I did a study on the church over the 20 years it had been in business. And the pastor that was there took it from 135 people down to about 20. So, that is possible. And it stayed at 20 for about 15 years. So that's the time we came along as youth pastors. So it is possible to go in the wrong direction, I guess, from a church growth point of view.
Yeah. Actually, not hard to do.
It's not hard at all.
I see a lot of atheists and skeptics online who every once in a while, and this is by no means everybody, but just a few, and they'll say things like, well, the church it's just money. It's just about money and power. That's all it is. And wow, that's not true. I think pastoring a church or serving as a minister in a church is one of the most challenging vocations there is. And I'd have to say that most of the pastors I know and have known in my life, they were good people. They are good people. They're sincere. They're not in it to make money. Most ministers don't make high salaries. So while I've left it and I no longer believe in it, I'm not ready to trash everybody who's doing it, because I think for the most part they're sincere.
But you could be sincerely misled, because you and I were both teachers and pastors.
Exactly.
I believed it. I preached it. I taught it in a Bible college for 8 years. I did the whole thing too. Now, though, I look back. I think you mentioned this before. You look back and say, "Who was that person?"
Right. Yeah, I look back
Was
now.
that you?
Right. I look back now and say, how, why did it take me so long to see what I now see? And I've got answers for that. I do understand why. One of the answers is that one of the first things you're taught when you become a part of at least an evangelical church, that's what I know about, or Southern Baptist, one of the first things you're taught is the worst thing you could ever do is quit. The worst thing you could ever do is walk away. That's a defeat. That's Satan winning. And if you walk away, if you're not in the church, you're out there, you're a non-believer, you're reachable. But if you're in it and you leave, you're something worse than that. And so there's all this, I guess, propaganda up front that sort of pre-programs you that no matter how many doubts you have or how hard it gets, just don't give up. And I think most of us, a basic human value is don't be a quitter. So those were things that kept me plugged in.
And of course, it leads to burnout in so many cases. We know I don't know what all the statistics are now, but there's a large number of pastors leaving the ministry every month, every year, never to return for various reasons.
Right.
Maybe that has something to do with my story. I quit out of burnout. I would say now, looking back on it, because I've been studying the cult so much, the cult psychology, the tactics and the manipulation, the coercion, the mind control, I was doing some of those things as a pastor, thinking I was doing all the right things. For example, I would heap guilt and shame on people because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. I was preaching sermons from the Bible, but I was telling people they weren't reading their Bibles enough, they weren't praying enough, they weren't witnessing enough, they weren't doing X, Y, Z. I was doing all these things that was actually doing psychological harm to people, thinking I was doing the right things.
Right. I remember when I first started preaching when I was a teenager, I would go to these Baptist churches in little West Texas towns. And at first, I didn't really have a lot to say. I was just I'd hear sermons by Billy Graham or by my own pastor. And so I would, I'd put something together, but I'd be somewhere preaching and I'm preaching a sermon and I say something like, and if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to hell and you're going to burn forever. And suddenly from the back, amen, amen, amen. It's like, wow. Okay. It's kind of like you're a comedian and you figure out, okay, that joke works. So I'm going to use that joke again. I went through a period where, I started to discover that the tougher I was in my sermon, really take the hard line against those non-believers, not so much against people sitting there, although there were also some people who liked it if you were hard on them. It's kind of like, hey, preacher, you gave me a great dose of guilt and shame today. Thank you so much. I needed that.
Thanks for the beating.
But for me, what happened to me is when I went to seminary, I was starting to have some questions about some of the shallowness of what I'd seen. And so I majored in pastoral care. And through that, and through studying psychology and counseling, I pulled back from some of that. And I started trying to do a more balanced, healthy approach. And I started trying not to use shame and guilt. And then eventually, by the time I got into the support group ministry, I was doing battle with shame. But ultimately, that's what made me start understanding, well, that's different because no matter how much you shade it, if your message is, okay, believe in Jesus and you'll spend eternity in heaven, don't believe and you will suffer in hell forever, well, man, there's shame and guilt there. It doesn't matter how you present it. The underlying message is, the same. And that reminds me of something else, because just before we started a while ago, I saw a Twitter post where apparently Joel Osteen went to or said something good about Lady Gaga and something she'd done about gay pride or something. And it reminded me how many times I used to see Rick Warren, for example, on Larry King. And Larry King would say, well, what about homosexuals? I mean, what's your stand on that? And so Rick Warren would say, well, Larry, we're all sinners. Everybody's welcome in our church. We're all sinners. And then that would be the end of it. And I was like, oh, my, Larry, let me tell you the follow-up question.
Yeah, there's no follow-up.
Ask him if he thinks they're going to heaven. Can they go to heaven if they're gay? And because I don't know, maybe I misread Rick Warren, but pretty sure he didn't think that. So I think there's a kind of a dishonesty. So the dynamic here is you're believing something that is ancient, and for centuries it didn't have a lot of challenge because for centuries people didn't move very far in their understanding of the world. But then several hundred years ago, there's Freud talking about the subconscious mind. There's Darwin talking about evolution. There's the discovery before that the earth is not the center of the universe. And so now fundamentalist believers of any religion are under pressure. And when that happens, you only have two options. You retrench and you double down on your outdated beliefs, or you start like you're in a sinking ship and you start throwing stuff overboard to lighten the weight. So you say, well, yeah, we used to believe that, but Genesis, that's just figurative. Unfortunately, it took the church hundreds and hundreds of years to figure that out, if it is a branch of the church that ever did. And usually the founders of that group, whoever they were, certainly took it literally.
Well, but it's ironic that thanks to psychologists and psychiatrists, we now know more about the psychology of, for example, the conversion experience. I did a podcast on the psychology of conversion, and after I read Robert J. Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, that's when it really hit me that, my God, the conversion experience, and it's not just unique to Christianity, it's in other religions and in cults as well. There's this intense psychological pressure, as you were saying, put on the recruit or the apparent convert, such that he or she reaches a breaking point and they kind of snap and they go, I need salvation, I need release, I need relief. Then here's the proffered salvation. You're going to heaven, and you're in the community. You're now accepted in the community, whatever that community might be. So thanks to the psychologists, we actually know a lot more about how the actual thing works from a human psychology point of view.
And take that. So when you're saying that, I'm thinking about our Vacation Bible School. Our church in Houston had one of the largest vacation Bible schools in the city. And if you're not familiar with that, what it is, it's a program for kids. They come, it's kind of like a day camp, lots of fun, crafts, games.
Snacks.
But a key part of it every year is you come in and the pastor talks to you about giving your life to Jesus. And that's how I got started as a Christian in a vacation Bible school. And for me, I did that very carefully because I was trying not to be manipulative. And so I tried not to put on a lot of pressure. I was like on, kind of a far end of the scale. We're doing it, but we're not trying to induce shame or guilt. But looking back on it, and think of it this way, one of the most frightening times for evangelical Christian parents is that period of time. Evangelicals talk about the age of accountability. So the child is innocent, but they reach this hard to define point in life, which is a different age for everybody, where they're old enough to understand the idea of sin, right and wrong, and they start becoming accountable. And at some point after they become accountable, they need to make that commitment to Jesus to be forgiven and become a Christian. So think about, this is something I've reflected on lately, Christian parents during that time of kind of sensing your child might be old enough, because you notice they're sort of squirming during the invitation at church to come forward and give your life to Jesus, but they haven't done it yet. And what if your child dies before they make that decision? Now you talk about pressure, and you're a child, your teachers, your parents, everybody around you says this is what you need to do. How on earth? And boy, the kid who doesn't do it, kudos to him or her, because that's powerful pressure. And one of the things that started working on me was the realization in studying church growth, and there's this whole language, this hymnology, choruses, theological concepts, teaching, Bible verses around the idea of adult salvation. I was lost, but now I'm found. I was a sinner, and I found Jesus, and my life changed. But when you look at it, at least in the United States, most people become Christians when they're children. And I so wanted to have adult converts, and I did. I was able to see some dramatic conversions now and then, but the majority of people were making that decision when they were children. And so it locks in, and it's very hard to change it, when it locks in at that point in time.
It's very difficult. If you've ever seen that documentary, Jesus Camp, that's,
yeah. Yeah,
a lot of this stuff. I know it's maybe an extreme example from the sense that it's a real hyper charismatic Pentecostal thing. Right. But the point about indoctrinating children, and you can see these children, they're crying and weeping and begging God, why haven't I been able to speak in tongues yet, God? Oh my God. And there's little kids, they're 7, 8, 9 years old, and already they're experiencing what I would say is religious trauma that's been placed on them by this, I would say, a cultic sort of psychological thing that's going on. It's unbelievable. Now, you mentioned, I know we wanted to get into talking about Trump. That point about tweets, you said that Christians will say, hey, you were never a Christian. In fact, I just had a guy today say the very same thing to me on Twitter, because I had posted out or tweeted out that you and I were going to be talking a little bit later on. And I said, we're going to be getting into Trump and some other things. And I put a tweet out about how many Christians or ex-evangelicals, for them was the Trump vote the last straw, because it was the last straw for me in calling myself a Christian. And one guy piped up and said, well, you were never a Christian. That's your problem. So we see the pushback. And I know you get more on Twitter than I think I do. I don't know. People come after you. Maybe I don't know why they come after you so much. They love taking you on.
I have a gift, I guess.
Is it a gift or a curse? I don't know.
Yeah, but I learn from those people because they remind me what's really out there. I guess I tried to get to a place of having a more reasoned faith, a more balanced faith, trying to, if somebody came to me and they were having psychological problems, I'd say, well, go to a counselor, you need to take an antidepressant, do it. So I was trying to be more on the enlightened side of things. And I want to think that a lot of the people we encounter on Twitter are not the best examples. And some of them, one of the things if they're just really annoying, I will ask them, well, where do you go to church? And are you a leader in your church? And I think sometimes they're kind of isolated people who have no voice anywhere else. But
except for Twitter.
Yeah,
that's their platform.
Right. Yeah. But it's amazing how they will make assumptions about you. And so, well, you never were a Christian, and that's where, okay, read my book. I will tell you that nobody who knows me has ever told me you were never a Christian. Nobody. I gave it 100%.
So did I. I did too. I tried. I wanted so hard. Well, I believed it. I never doubted it. Well, I shouldn't say that I never doubted it. I did have the cognitive dissonance a few times, but there was always that person to talk me back around. I was always find that mature Christian who could talk me down from the ledge, as it were. And I wasn't at the time, I never thought about quitting the faith. I was just having legitimate doubts, and somehow I would always come back around and stuff that cognitive dissonance. And I wonder if that's some of what goes on with these people that we encounter on Twitter, that they're so vehement about proving, quote unquote, that you, Tim, and I, we were never Christians, and that is, shouting down their own cognitive dissonance. Because what's the alternative? If we were genuinely Christians and we've walked away from the faith, that says a lot about their own theology. Surely. Right.
And it means that as sure as they are today of their salvation, tomorrow they might not be, if they acknowledge what happened to you and to me.
Yeah, it's a virus, and I think people have said that it's like a virus that they're thinking is going to spread. We're contagious, so you and I and other people like us are contagious. I was reminded of David Hayward, the naked pastor up in Canada. We're very kindred spirits in the sense, kind of like you and I, ex-pastors coming out of ministry and teaching and evangelicalism and all that, and he gets the same kind of pushback on Twitter and Facebook too. So we're certainly not alone in this thing, being accused of never being a Christian. But does that feed into some of the Trump evangelical thing, the fear? I think I sent you an article where a guy recently argued on Time magazine that evangelicals are motivated more out of fear than anything else, and that's why they're voting for Trump. That's one of the main reasons. What's your take?
Well, okay, this is a good topic because, man, I can't tell you how much time I've spent trying to figure this out. I can tell you that when I was an evangelical pastor, I would never have supported Donald Trump. And most of the pastors I knew who were educated as I was, at the same level and kind of thought the same way, would never have bought into this. For me, while I was still a Southern Baptist pastor, one of the things that was happening was a group of fundamentalists were taking over the Southern Baptist Convention. And even though, and Southern Baptists were and are the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, and even though to the outside world we always looked really conservative, there was a lot of diversity within a certain range of theological beliefs in our denomination. And we had 6 seminaries, and we had 2 or 3 of them that had professors who were kind of on the liberal end of the spectrum of Christian theology. So the fundamentalists started taking over, and I was in a really odd position because I'd gone to Wheaton College, and that's kind of a bastion of conservative evangelical Christianity. So a lot of the issues they were bringing up, I'd say, well, that's what I think. I think the Bible is completely the Word of God. It's without error. I agree, but I had trouble, and I did identify with the group at first, but then after I watched them for a while, it's like, wow, these guys are mean. They lie. They, some of them aren't very smart. And,
smart.
And even
the
though,
worst thing you could say.
And even though I'm conservative in my theology like they are, I don't think so. I'm not going to side with this. And there were crazy things that happened. I was on the board of a Baptist university here in Houston back in the 80s, and we were having a board meeting one day. The president of the university says that somebody has donated a television TV tower to the university. And until we can sell it, he said, we're going to be getting income from all the different TV channels that pay to use this tower to retransmit their signals. So I'm sitting there with my pastor friend on the board, and we're the sort of the liberals. We're not part of the fundamentalist group. But I raise my hand and say, well, I have a question. Is there any pornography transmitted over this TV tower? And the president said, well, I don't know. And here's what was so interesting. We had several laymen on the board from the whole fundamentalist takeover in Southern Baptist life was being largely spearheaded by 2 megachurches in Houston. And the laymen from those 2 churches came after me, and they said things like, well, what do you mean? Even network TV has bad programming. We shouldn't turn away from this money because there might be pornography on it. And then the pastor of one of those mega churches who was there, but we just had lunch, and he had fallen asleep, and he weighed about 300 pounds, and he'd fallen asleep, and he woke up and he saw his guys arguing with me and my liberal friend. And so he started taking their side. But then after it went on a while, he realized what he was talking about. And so he took my friend and I out to lunch afterwards, something he never did because he realized he didn't want word to get out what side he'd been on. But I mean, this was so this was crazy. And I saw this over and over. They outwardly take these hard positions against, we're totally against this, totally against that. But another one of these churches, and I just knew this because of one of my friends, a minister, knew about it. One of their staff members had a gay affair with another man. He confessed it. So what do? They quietly help him go to another church. They help him keep it a secret. Why?
Just shuffle them off, huh?
Yeah. So on the one hand, they're taking all these just heavy positions outwardly, but when stuff happened in their own little place, they'd keep it quiet because they didn't want to look bad. So the thing that I started seeing is that some of this is kind of a game, and it's tribal, because if you're in the tribe and you do something wrong, If you're really in the tribe, you may get a pass, at least once or twice. But if you're outside the tribe, and so where do we see this on a larger scale? Hillary Clinton, her husband had an affair. Donald Trump, multiple affairs. Porn star, no
question about it.
He brags that he sexually assaults women. That's okay, because we've added him to our tribe. So the question is why? And I know you've got probably better ideas than I do on this, and I hope you'll share some of those. But the thing that I've just, because in thinking about this leading up to our discussion today, something finally dawned on me. And so I'm going to share my wisdom here. We'll see, see what you think.
Yeah, lay it on us.
So it's like this. I read several years ago that anytime the rate of change accelerates, fundamentalism in all kinds of religions will increase. Because change, especially new knowledge that affects everybody, or trends, changes in culture, it frightens fundamentalists. And they have nowhere to go because they're locked in. Their holy book is locked. And so they have to be anti-gay. That's what the good book says. So if you think about all the things that are happening, and really there are a lot of things happening that are actually kind of scary to any human being. The rise of artificial intelligence. If we think about, so what we're hearing is that a lot of truck drivers may lose their jobs because of self-driving vehicles, and artificial intelligence is going to be taking over many, many jobs. They're going to be designer babies. Parents in the not too distant future, it looks like, are going to be able to make many kinds of selections, not only about gender, but IQ and personality traits and all kinds of things. And then there's the steamroller of LGBTQ rights. And the younger generation is, if you're around millennials, most of them that I know, they're not uptight about somebody being gay. I mean, they've got this, I can't even keep up with the list of sexual orientation choices that they just accept as a matter of course. So you've got all these changes happening. And it's like the future is coming in and you can't stop it. And along comes a man who says, "Make America great again." And then the more you listen to him, he wants to go back. He wants to go back to pre-civil rights. He wants to go back to white people being the best. As a shrewd individual, he recognizes the evangelical vote, the Christian right, and so he takes their side. He talks about Christmas. Now, my family, I have family and friends that, most of my family and friends are still Christians. And so we celebrate Christmas. I mean, we give gifts and we get together. I've never seen anybody have any restriction on their celebration of Christmas. But Donald Trump says, okay, we're going to protect Christmas.
So to me, you're going to be able to say Merry Christmas again.
Yeah.
Because it's been banned, apparently. I don't know.
Yeah, right. So, and you've got this group of people who, by definition, are living to some extent in an alternate reality. Here's an example. And I had something kind of close to this happen to me. A guy is in Houston, Texas, big oil town. He's a geologist for a major oil company. What does he do for them? He helps them figure out where to find the oil that's there, because millions and millions of years ago, little creatures, plants, animals died, and they became oil over a period of time. That's what he does. And the very work he does, and the oil and the gasoline that we put into our cars, is based on the scientific understanding of the ancient age of the earth and how oil came to be, based on these millions of years ago events. And then he goes to the church where I'm the pastor, and I'm saying, somebody says, how old is the earth? And I say, well, evolution might be true. It might be millions of years old, but who knows? How do you know? I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but I would say, how do you know that on day one, if you'd done some kind of sophisticated dating test on a rock, that it wouldn't have tested billions of years old on day one? God can do anything. Yeah, so maybe God made the earth. God made the earth look old. Now that's a cognitive
the appearance of age. Yeah.
That's a cognitive dissonance in this guy who's making his living on geology, which is based on, the earth is billions of years old. And some of his co-workers are probably going to churches where the pastor is saying, no, the earth is 6,000 years old. So you've got people who are already living this situation where here's reality and here's my view of it. And you have the Bible that's telling you things aren't as they appear. There's an invisible world out there of spirits and principalities and demons and angels and everything. There's a spiritual war going on. So as an evangelical Christian or a right-wing Christian, you're already believing that things are not what they appear to be. So now you have a president, a leader who comes along and says, what you're seeing isn't real. This isn't what is really happening. So the bottom line is, I think it's like think of an individual who gets really scared. Let's say somebody's their car breaks down on a lonely road and there are wild animals all over that area. There's mountain lions. And they walk down the dark road for a while worrying about a mountain lion or a bear or something coming out of the woods and consuming them. And some lights appear in the distance, and this lone car comes up. And the guy stops, and he's a sketchy looking guy. He looks scary for whatever reason. You just have the sense, I don't know. But the person who would never get into the car with that guy normally, if there's enough fear about what else is going to happen, gets in the car with him because he's out of options. It's the only option I've got. So that's the best I can come up with because, and it's so many have said it. Well, you've said it in your blog article and other ways too. Donald Trump should be the last person in the world evangelicals would support. And if Barack Obama had done one of the countless things that Donald Trump has done, he would already have been impeached by the Republicans. So it's a mystery. Now, I like what you've said about the idea of Trumpism as a cult. That makes a lot of sense to me as well. And I think it plays into the idea of fear too.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, would you get into that car with Charles Manson if the more existential fear looks to be worse? The mountain lions, that's a good analogy. I like what you're saying. Well, as something that you said kind of triggered my thought about fundamentalism. You could see that, like you say, historically, there's been many, many times historically where when things have changed in societies, there's been a surge toward fundamentalism, whether it's a guy like Savonarola burning, the bonfire of the vanities in Florence and things like that, or going more recently, I talked to Conway and Siegelman, who wrote Holy Terror, which is a really fascinating study of American fundamentalism they go back to the Goldwater era when Barry Goldwater lost the presidency. And that's really, they say, when people like Jerry Falwell Sr. and others were really getting mobilized and getting the Catholics and the evangelicals together because they said, look, we can't lose the next time around. And they mobilized that vote on the subject of abortion, which was the only thing that both of the camps agreed on. They had huge theological differences, but they agreed on abortion. And so he was able to mobilize that block and get Reagan elected, as he kind of like Trump got in bed with that evangelical/Catholic base. And so what I talked about with them was, I think that trajectory that we're seeing with Trump and the evangelicals is the same line that people like Falwell Sr. started back in the late 70s and early 80s. Now, you must have been a part of all that, being in that mainstream Southern Baptist thing right in the 80s.
Yeah, I said when I was young, I was a Republican. I was a Democrat. I was against the Vietnam War. And you
were a real liberal then.
Yeah, but and interestingly enough, Wheaton College had a pretty strong group of students who were against the war, and it was really a dilemma for the leadership of the college at that time. I think they were like pulling their hair out. Then there was a point where the Democrats started really pushing pro-choice, gay rights. There was a point where I voted Republican for a few years. And then when George W. Bush ran for the second time, based on what was happening in Iraq and all of that. Then I came back to the Democratic Party while I was still a Christian.
Right. You jumped ship at that point.
Yeah, because to me, and you can build a case for either direction in the Bible. I think you have to go a little bit more Old Testament to get with the Republican view of things, but the Democrats really, to me, key in more with Jesus's teaching about I was sick and you visited me, I was in prison and you came to see me. And of course the answer was always, well, yeah, we believe in that stuff, but not the government doing it. About a month ago, I did a little study on my own. I totaled up the total amount of the United States welfare budget. And then I got some numbers on just a rough estimate of all the giving by all the churches in the United States. And then I used the concept that every church I've ever known, the most any church I've ever seen, give to really helping people who are down and out, because most of their budget goes to staff, buildings, debt, utilities, insurance. So you've got maybe 5 or 10% left to do benevolence. And so if all the United States government welfare went away and you just turned it over to churches, it would drop by about 95%. So there. In other words, churches don't give enough and have enough to meet those needs. And so I think that's a cop-out to say, well, we believe in doing it. We just think it ought to be through the church and not through government.
Yeah, I remember saying that when I was a Christian, the churches should be doing this, that, and the other thing. Why do we rely on the government to do it? But the fact is, we were struggling to make budget. And as you say, almost all of our salary, I wouldn't even say 95%, it was like 98, 99% was just to meet all of our overheads. Like you say, the building and the staff salaries and all the expenses and stuff. Right. So that's the truth is, if it wasn't for the government, the churches are not prepared to step into the breach and take that on.
Yeah. So the really confusing thing, I learned in the Southern Baptist Church that Jesus loves the little children. We sang a song with those words. And I learned compassion. It was in my theological studies that I learned that God loves everybody. It doesn't matter what color they are. I learned that Christianity is not a nationalistic religion. It's a worldwide faith if you understand it and practice it right. So the idea that Christianity could somehow be used to say, well, we're better than them, people who are coming from the outside, people who are afraid of being murdered and trying to find asylum in the United States, well, too bad if their kids get locked in a cage. Wow, I just don't understand how anybody who claims to be a Christian or who claims to just be a moral person can accept that. It's just,
how can you get behind that? Yeah, it is shocking. I mean, you got to wonder, and it goes back to that Time article, isn't it? Is it true that a lot of the motivation driving evangelicals is, as you say, fear? In the sense that not only are they afraid of the changes in society, but one of the hallmarks of fundamentalism, full stop, is it's a desire to return to a fabled golden age, as you were saying a minute ago, whatever that age might have been. It's a resistance against the forces of modernism. And so, I mean, I always talk about the, Christian fundamentalism around about the turn of the century, which of course was a reaction against liberal Christianity. And so all those things that you just talked about in this militant Christian fundamentalism are also true of political fundamentalism. And, so those kind of can be strange bedfellows maybe, but maybe not so strange. They've been in bed with the fundamentalists since the 80s. The Republicans have been, for sure.
Yeah, and I have to say, I wish I could say that I'm confident that everything's going to be okay, but I'm really not. Because one of the things I've decided watching all of this since 2016 is that a lot of people don't think very well. They don't think. They don't really take the time. So like if you say, well, no, all this stuff about Trump isn't true, it's fake news. Well, how about when you watch him on a videotape when he brags about grabbing women in the pelvic area? I mean, do you think that tape was made up? But then it's complicated.
Some
because
have even
today,
said that.
Yeah, but today we're learning. I've forgotten the term for it, but that's possible. That's getting to be possible. So any of us might see a video or a picture of ourselves naked or saying something we didn't say because of the technology. So I guess they do have a little bit of a leg to stand on when they say that. But he surrounded himself with criminals. People have gone to prison. It's just incredible. I mean, I don't know. It's discouraging. It's really
very
discouraging.
And I think for a lot of people, a lot of Christians, ex-evangelicals, I've found this a lot. Even my tweet today, I've tweeted it out before, and I've had a lot of responses on that question. Was that the last straw? And almost overwhelmingly, people will say, yeah, that was the point at which I no longer wanted to be identified as a Christian. I was already on my way out. That was the last sort of push. And that's the question, though. Where is it all going? Because you're saying, I don't know. Because, for example, these anti-abortion laws that we're suddenly seeing popping up in various states, to me, they're saying this is our chance. They've been trying to overturn Roe versus Wade, for example. That was one of the things that Falwell Sr. was able to mobilize the Catholics and the evangelicals on way back in 1980, because it had just been passed in, I think, 72. So it wasn't that long on the books. They've been trying to overturn it. And now you get crazy stuff like today. There was the story about the woman in Alabama. She was shot in the stomach, a pregnant woman, had a miscarriage as a result of being shot. Now they're saying she could go to prison for having a miscarriage. That's the insanity of these sorts of laws. But that's we're heading towards like a Handmaid's Tale type scenario.
Yeah. My wife and I watch The Handmaid's Tale every week, and that's frightening because, and I saw Elizabeth Moss interviewed on some late night show a few weeks ago, and they were talking about, well, they didn't really plan it that way, but that show has taken on a new level of meaning in the Trump era.
Yeah, it has.
It's just really, really powerful. So I wish I knew a good answer for how to bring about change. I mean, all I know is vote and support candidates. But here in the U.S., there's really, I think a lot of people have a strong feeling of helplessness right now. And it's like, even if we win the election and elect somebody who's not Trump, it's not just Trump. It's this 1/3 or so of the country who think he's a great guy, who at least are willing to say, well, yeah, we know what he's like, but it's okay. It's okay if you get the right people on the Supreme Court. And then you have a guy on the Supreme Court who had credible accusations of sexual assault made, and those were just, sort of pushed aside.
Brushed under the rug. That's just happened. Yeah, because you're right. If let's say a Democrat wins the 2020 election, that Trump base isn't going to just leave America tomorrow when that candidate wins. Right.
Exactly.
So they're not going anywhere. And we were just talking about that at work today with some of my British friends at work, and they were trying to figure out what the hell's going on over here. But we've got the same thing here with all the Brexit stuff going on in Britain. People are feeling that sense of helplessness. We're watching our politicians flail and get nothing done, and we're going, whoa, how come we don't seemingly have a voice in any of this stuff? We're watching all this stuff, and I think it's not just an American thing. It may be a global thing. So, yeah, I think education, I would say, is a critical thing, along with what you were saying. Something I've learned in studying the cults and the psychology of it, it's helped me to kind of unpick the conditioning, the things that I was taught and I taught people. It's helped kind of demystify and disempower a lot of the hold that I think it did have on me. So that's one thing. So we got to go back and read your book. That's a thing, isn't it, where you need to help educate people? Because I like what you said at the beginning. Who's this book for? It's not just for the person who's left the faith. It might be for someone who's questioning, or you've got a spectrum of potential readers there, haven't you?
Yeah, I think my target is, it'd be two groups in particular. One would be a person who's never been religious, but who wants to really understand what it's like inside that world. And part of that is understanding it's not all crazy. It's not all bad. There's a reason people like church. There's certain needs they're having met, and they're not necessarily bad people. It's just that what underlies it isn't true, and it doesn't work as advertised. My other audience is those people who are in that world now. If they read my story, that they at least, it's going to make them uncomfortable. At least it will do that, and maybe it will make them think. I don't really have illusions about if somebody's strong in their faith. My book, nothing anybody says I think is going to just change them overnight. But I know for me, there were things that happened over the years. When I was a college student in the Chicago area, I had been into the Campus Crusade. There was some Holy Spirit, deeper life thing, and I was really into that, being filled with the Spirit. And I met this young businessman at some event or something, really a sharp guy, and we were talking, and I did my little testimonial about being filled with the Spirit. And he was totally nice, totally respectful, but he looked at me and said, if I thought like that, I think I'd go crazy. I never, decades later, I never forgot what he said. And I used to teach lifestyle evangelism, and one of the ideas of reaching people for religion, the best way to do it is not knocking on doors, but it's like in the course of life, a little tap here, a little message there, and the idea is that it all adds up. So I do know that sometimes the things we say, even though, and there were things that people said to me and they walked away and they would have said outwardly, man, that didn't get through at all. That didn't make a dent on him. But yes, it did, because I never forgot it. And I thought about it. A middle school student asked me in my last pastorate, well, Pastor, and he admired me. He great kid, sharp. He said, what about the dinosaurs? How does that fit in, And I didn't really have a good answer. I just sort of, said, well, we don't know. We just have to trust God. We don't understand everything.
Kind of punted on that.
Yeah. And, but the fact, I remembered that feeling, and all of these things came back to me when I finally got to where, and here's the key, getting to the place where you will follow the truth wherever it leads. Religion puts guardrails on your brain. If the, quote, truth leads you over there, don't go there. Don't listen to that. That's the devil. Don't listen to that. Don't look at that. Don't read that. Don't think about that. I challenge anyone, no matter who they are. And even on the atheist side, we can get into the same mindset where we're closed-minded. For me, what I'm trying to do the rest of my life is follow the truth wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable that makes me. I think that's the way to go.
That is the way to go. That might be a good place to end it then, because, there's a lot we could get into. I was just thinking about thought-terminating cliches and Christianese and things like that, but those are techniques that are designed to stop you from thinking critically. And that's straight out of the cult playbook. And I remember as a Christian, I just saw it on Twitter today. Someone responded, I don't let someone else's hypocrisy in their faith dissuade me from being a Christian. And it was this very blanket statement that was just matter of fact. That's not a problem for me. I have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Whatever anyone else does it's not none of my concern. Mm-hmm. And she was so matter of fact about it. I thought that's just straight thought-terminating cliches. That's loaded language. That's I'm fine. I don't care what you say about the Trump evangelicals. Not going to bother me at all.
Yep, that's true.
So you're right in there then.
One thing I try to keep in mind, it took me about 5 decades to start really thinking clearly. So I need to be patient with other people.
That's a good point. Yeah. It takes a long, long time. And I've said this before. I picked it up from somewhere that someone said, as long as you were in the religion or the cult as many years, it's probably going to take at least that many to come out of it on the other side. So you guys,
that's bad news for me.
That's bad news for you, but
I'm going to be dead.
We'll be still working on it.
Yeah. Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
How can people get a hold of you? Because I know you're now reactivated on Twitter. You were taking a break there for a while, and everybody was wondering where you went. But how can people? Is that the best way to get a hold of you? Is on Twitter? Yeah, well,
you can follow me. Goodbye _ Jesus on Twitter is my handle. I have a website, movingtruths.com, and that's something that's still under development, but it's kind of a secular motivation thing to kind of just have words of encouragement and enlightenment. And also timsledge.com is another place where you can contact me.
Right, so there's ways to get a hold of you. Now, I know we said we weren't going to talk about your story, and we, for the most part, we didn't. We're going to point people to your book, but I don't know if you'd be interested coming back at another point, because I think you and I, we really need to get into not necessarily your story, but the sort of theological deconstruction of the whole thing, because I've got a lot of questions. I got a lot of problems with the God of the Bible. I think of myself, I'm probably more of an agnostic at this point, but I've got a lot of questions. So you would be a perfect person, I think, to have a good discussion around those kinds of topics. I don't know if you'd be interested in doing something like that at a later date.
Oh, yeah, that sounds good. And I also, this thing of labels really is troubling to me. I don't believe there is a personal loving God. I mean, I have no question about that. Is there some unexplained force we don't know about yet? Some scientific or maybe, I don't know, because I am now, as I said earlier, I'm trying to follow the truth wherever it leads. I can identify with a level 6 atheist using Richard Dawkins' definition, or call myself an agnostic. But what I really want to do for the rest of my life is I want to be a person who is pro living life to the fullest, a person who is intellectually alive, a person who's interested in things like kindness, generosity, love, building quality of life. So for me, I don't want to just spend the rest of my life saying what I no longer believe. I want to share something positive, an alternative way to live a meaningful life, to live a value-driven life without relying on the crippling effects of religious ideas that just aren't true.
That is a great statement. I think that reminds me of, as I was saying, you, me, and David Hayward, we have that same, ironically, see, I would argue that what you just said is a pastoral theology of ministry statement. It really is, isn't it? Mm-hmm. You could say what you just said, a lot of pastors would love to have something like they put some Bible verses in there maybe, but what you're doing, what I'm doing, what David Hayward, people like us are, I think it is pastoral ministry, ironically, even though we're not in church, we're not Christians anymore. It's I still think of it. I'm helping people. You're helping people. Mm-hmm. But it's aside from, as you say, the crippling and psychologically damaging effects of religion, which is such an irony. Everything they promised us that was supposed to happen, they didn't deliver, and instead we got trauma and abuse and burnout and all these other things, and Trump.
Yeah.
So we got to rebuild from all that.
Exactly, and if I go back to the core of when I was a teenager and I was felt called to the ministry, what I really wanted to do was help people. I wanted to inspire people. I wanted to help people to grow. And even my Myers-Briggs personality type is ENFJ. And the last time I looked, I think that says, well, you might be a minister, a psychologist, or something like that. So I think maybe for a lot of us, it's kind of in our genes. It's kind of just the core of our personality. And so I really wanted to help people change for the better. And I didn't mean that as an arrogant thing. I just I knew that I could grow. I'd learned ways that I could grow and life could be better. And I still want that. I still want to make a positive contribution, to be an encouraging person. And so I think one of the cutting edge things for me, but I also feel like yourself, there's something of value in listening to the story of somebody who was totally in it, a minister. At first, I think, well, this didn't make any sense, but when I've studied more, when I've had more experiences, I'll be able to explain it. Okay, well, I had pretty much a full lifetime of all of that, and my conclusion is it doesn't work as advertised. So I think I have something to say. I think you have, and others like us have something to say that maybe gets a little bit more attention, and I don't want to stop doing that. But again, I want to share a positive message too. And that's what my movingtruths.com website is about. And that's another area that I'm working on developing.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because I've switched gears too. As of about last September, when we did a live podcast when I was in Seattle over there last year. Me and Stacy Ray, she came down from Canada, and we did a live podcast, and we talked about it beforehand. We said we really need to start focusing on the reconstruction. We had focused, I had exclusively focused on deconstructing my faith and helping other people do that. But I realized I was kind of sort of stuck in the sort of the anger part. I was so angry, as it's very common, isn't it? People who go, hey, I was lied to, I was manipulated, I was coerced, I'm pissed off. But there comes a point when you've got to move past that. And yeah, I mean, I still deal with it sometimes, but for me, it's more about the values you just articulated. So I'm definitely glad to have met you. I'm glad that you came back on Twitter after your self-imposed exile. And thanks for talking for this little bit of time. So we'll come back again at some point, it sounds like, and we'll talk some theology. We'll do some deconstruction.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me, Clint. I enjoyed it.
Well, even though Tim got the last word, I can say that I thoroughly enjoyed it as well. I love meeting kindred spirits like Tim, and we definitely have made a connection, and this is something that I want to do. I've been thinking about this. I want to do a podcast with me, Tim Sledge, and David Hayward. Since we have such kind of interesting and parallel backgrounds, I think it'd be really fascinating to have a three-way, maybe like a Zoom call that I record as we talk about specifically some of the finer points of our deconstruction. This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. What are some of the very specific issues that I personally have with the God of the Bible, with the God of evangelicalism, with Christian theology, and with some of the teachings in the Bible, even some of Jesus' sayings, as well as that of Paul. And of course, then you get into genocide in the Old Testament and all sorts of other things. And all of that starts to stack up. In fact, Tim wrote just a funny article the other day about who cleans the toilets in heaven? Where does all the poop go? And you think, wait a minute, it's a funny kind of thing, but it makes a point, and that is we never talk about that kind of stuff in the church. We never talked about those kind of nitty-gritty sort of things. We just sort of assumed that we were all just going to go to heaven. It was going to be wonderful and amazing. But what about some of these finer details on which the Bible is completely silent, and we just sort of leave it up to the person's imagination to fill in all the blanks, and it's going to be great and amazing and wonderful. But how many people, how many Christians are basing essentially where they consider their eternal destiny on something, an ancient book, the word of a preacher, the word of somebody who's written a book about heaven or the afterlife or whatever? How many people are basing their faith, their lives, everything on the word of this book? So these are very interesting questions. So this is something I'm going to be working on. Okay, a couple of things as I wrap it up. I want to say a couple of thank yous. First of all, thank you to Laura Anderson as well as to Margaret Fletcher, Rebel Lady 2550 on Twitter, for being the latest Patreon supporters of Mindshift Podcast. Now, what do you get for helping me to support this show? What is it that you get as a benefit? Well, for one thing, you get early access to every show on Wednesday. You don't have to wait till Friday until it comes out on iTunes and Podbean and everywhere else. You get early access to the shows on Patreon. The other thing that we've been doing as part of our closed Mindshift podcast group, this is something that's really cool. We have this group on Facebook for Patreon supporters, and we've been doing monthly Zoom calls. Now, one of the things that's so cool is this month I'm going to be having Conway and Siegelman as our guests. So I've reconnected with them. I had such great response after the podcast that we did that people in the group said, in the last Zoom call, they said, can you get Conway and Siegelman? So I messaged them, and yes, they're going to drop in August. And in the next month, we're going to have Claudine Gallagher, who actually, she and I did a podcast. That's going to be coming out. She's an ex-Mormon, so look for that. But she also is like a life coach. She helps people with religious trauma, reconstructing, and I'm going to have her drop in September for our Zoom call. So these are great benefits that you get as a Patreon supporter of the show. So thank you to these two gals for being the latest supporters of Mindshift Podcast. If you can't afford it, don't worry about it. Do me a favor, though. At least you can help the show by going on iTunes or Podbean or whatever platform, Spotify or Stitcher, that you listen to the show leave a 5-star review. It really does help the show. Tell your friends about it. That would be great. If you could at least do that, I would really appreciate it. So thanks for listening in to this conversation with myself and Tim Sledge. Don't forget, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be having an episode with Brielle Decker-Blanchard, who was one of the wives of the infamous FLDS cult leader Warren Jeffs. I think I said she was his 57th wife, but I think in actuality, she was something like his 75th wife. That's what I meant to say. So her story of escaping the FLDS cult is an unbelievable one. That is coming up in 2 weeks. So thanks again for joining me. I've been your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. If you want to follow me, jump on Twitter and find me at Mindshift 2018. I'll also leave Tim Sledge's, as I said, his contact information in the show notes. So look for that if you want to get in touch with Tim and do some further dialogue. Look at some of the stuff he's written, pick up his book, Goodbye Jesus, and find out the rest of his story. So I'll see you in a couple of weeks with Brielle Decker-Blanchard telling her amazing story of escaping from the FLDS cult. Thanks again for joining me. I'll see you again right here on Mindshift Podcast.